AOC Gets Democracy. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, that's kind of the headline in the New York Times. It's an opinion piece, so that means it was not on the front page, or at least that's what it used to mean. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez understands democracy better than Republicans do. And Bill, in the course of this article, the columnist, a person named Jamelle Bouie, basically says that two of the old saws that Republicans like to trot out about the difference between a republic and a democracy are simply not the case. And I'll give you the first one to deal with because the allegation is that if we got rid of the Electoral College, which is what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was essentially lobbying for on Twitter before being slapped back by Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas, who said that she didn't understand the difference between republic and democracy. Anyway, if we got rid of the Electoral College, Republicans allege that that the urban areas would dominate the country and that nobody but a Democrat would ever be elected president again because those urban areas have more than enough votes to ensure that. According to this columnist, and he's drawing on some research by an academic, it says, hey, that's just not so. The cities not only have a lot of Democrats, but they have a lot of Republicans, and there are Democrats in rural areas as well. And so any candidate who campaigns for the presidency would have to go all over the country anyway. The only difference would be that the election wouldn't be decided by a few swing voters in a handful of Rust Belt states.
Aha. And who's this guy writing for?
The New York Times. It's a newspaper in New York City.
I've heard. And I think really you get now to the core of it, because the idea that an election could be determined by a handful of voters out in these Rust Belt states is just very distasteful, if not disgusting, to somebody who lives in New York City.
Yeah, but if that were the case, wouldn't it be, wouldn't he be making the case that it would be a good thing? Essentially, what you're saying is he's lying about the fact that Democrats wouldn't win because of the urban votes.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
So,
yes, he's lying. So
in these Rust Belt states, the way that President Trump managed to pull off a victory was essentially by swinging Democrat voters, was it not?
It was. As a matter of fact, Donald Trump won the presidency by the antiquated and quite charming idea that if you want to win a state, you really ought to go there, campaign in it, understand what the problems of the people of that state are, and address those problems. Hillary Clinton was absolutely sure she had those states sewn up, so she didn't visit, she didn't give them any time, didn't give them any respect, didn't address any of their problems, and it cost her the ascendancy that was obviously due to a person of her rank and prestige. So, all of this is just not terribly surprising. The part I'm trying to get a handle on is how does this make the case that AOC understands the republic better than the Republicans?
Essentially, what he's saying is that AOC calling for the abolishment of the Electoral College understands that the framers, when they were talking about democracy, were not talking about a representative democracy like the one they framed, but rather direct democracy, which they would downplay as one of the problems of the Greek model, let's call it.
Right. Precisely correct. That's exactly what I thought she was saying. Which means that now we know for an absolute fact, without question, we can infer that many millions more, but we can now state with the clarity of logic that there are at least two people who clearly do not understand the difference between a democracy and the public. One of them is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You can only imagine my shock. I'm only strapped into this chair as a reason I didn't fall out. And the second person we can be absolutely sure doesn't know anything about the difference between the two is the clown that wrote this article. He's basically saying that she understands a republic better than Republicans do because she's calling it a democracy. And she's calling for it to be a democracy, at least in an extremely narrow set of circumstances. So she doesn't understand the difference between a republic and the democracy. And furthermore, the guy who's writing this article doesn't understand it because he's not making the case that she understands a republic. He's making a case that if you were to take away all of the protections of a Republican could still theoretically win. And that's not the same thing. And parenthetically, we don't have a republic so that Republicans can occasionally win elections. We have a republic to avoid the dangers of pure democracy, which have been clearly spelled out throughout all of history to the founders, and who understood the difference between a republic and a democracy and decided on a republic.
Well, what Jamelle Bouie is saying in the New York Times is that there's no risk of the dangers of a direct democracy because the Constitution doesn't frame a direct democracy. It frames a representative democracy.
It frames a representative democracy. Among the many other things that it uses to frame a representative democracy is the idea of an electoral college where the president is elected by the states. That's one of the things that defines it as a republic, and it's one of the things that AOC and this clown are trying to eliminate.
Let me read you the tweet that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, by the way, is a congressional representative. She is from New York.
Well, she's
City.
She's not. If you ask her constituents,
but
because her disapproval ratings are something like 79%. But
I'm quoting from the New York Times. Ocasio-Cortez made the case against the Electoral College and argued for a national popular vote to choose the president. And here's the quote from her tweet. Every vote should be equal in America, no matter who you are or where you come from. The right thing to do is establish a popular vote, and GOP will do everything they can to fight it.
She's not calling for a direct democracy, of course. She thinks she is. But if she was calling for a direct democracy, she'd be out of a job.
Well, I don't think she thinks she's calling for that, or at least this author, in endorsing what she's saying, is not saying she's calling for a direct democracy.
No. She's invoking the idea of a direct democracy instead of a representative democracy. The representative democracy, the republic, is protected by a series of rules that protect your individual rights no matter what the majority of idiots happens to think at the time. So she is basically saying we should get rid of those series of protections and go to what she is calling a true democracy or a pure democracy where everybody's vote counts as the same thing. Well, turns out everybody's vote does count as the same thing because the people who elect the electors are the people who also get to vote in the presidential election. It's not like they don't have representation. It's not like I don't have representation for who the president is. I vote in my state. My state casts its vote for the person who carries the state. That's how it's supposed to be done.
So you're saying it's not too much of a stretch for somebody who's making the argument that Ocasio-Cortez seems to be making, which is we should have direct popular vote of the president of the United States. It wouldn't be too much of a leap to say, and each person should have a direct vote on legislation that stands before the country.
Precisely correct. So what she's basically saying is, and what all the Democrats are saying is, we want to adjust these Republican protections. We want to adjust them down a little bit. We want to take some of these protections down just enough so that we can win elections for all time. But we don't want to go to a real democracy because an actual, authentic, true democracy, as in the name of the Democratic Party, would mean that every single citizen gets to vote on every single piece of legislation. And they don't want that. I think Republicans would rather see that than Democrats would. The entire aspect of it is to use this word democracy and all of the things that it represents and all of the good things that it represents, and to shroud themselves in these robes and laurels, and use that to take away all of the freedoms and all of the advantages that made this representative democracy work in the first place.
So Representative Dan Crenshaw from Texas, a Republican, responded to Ocasio-Cortez on Twitter. This is what passes for debate in this country. We live in a republic, which means that 51% of the population doesn't get to boss around the other 49%. And yet, Bill, the author of this column in the New York Times, Jamelle Bouie, said that the framers of the Constitution never intended to set up rule by minority, which is essentially what you have if a minority of the electorate can select the president of the United States.
Well, Jamelle, whose deep knowledge of the founders, I'm going to just have to bow to, I guess, is missing the point in so many ways that we don't have enough time to go into them all. But one of them is to suggest that the president of the United States is the dictator of the United States, that the president sits in his throne and issues dictates that then become law. Now, that is true how Barack Obama pretty much governed because he had a pen and a phone. But to say that 51% of the 49% of the population is being run by 51% of the population because the president was elected by the Electoral College is just plain nonsense. It has to be one party or another. The chief executive, well, if you'd asked the original founders, they would have said, what is this party thing? But nevertheless, it's going to be a Republican or a Democrat. That's going to be determined by how the states vote. So what he's really saying is he doesn't like the idea that 49% of the people get to tell 51% of the people what to do. Well, they don't. Donald Trump doesn't get to tell the people what to do. Donald Trump is the chief executive whose essential function, despite all of the rest of this stuff, internally to the country, the president doesn't set economic policies. He determines a mood and a level of confidence. The president's only actual job in terms of the governance of the country that really has any significance at all is that he either signs a bill into law or he vetoes it. That's it. The actual laws that are submitted and the laws that are passed through the Congress, which consists of the House of Representatives and the Senate, both of which, especially now since the 17th Amendment, are directly represented by the people. So this idea that the president is the king and that he has absolute control over everybody else is just nuts.
Well, I think you're taking the argument to the extreme because nobody's saying that the president has absolute control, but the presidency is a significant office. He is the commander-in-chief. He does have executive authority within the realm of the agencies that are under his purview. Okay, he does have the bully pulpit. There are a lot of advantages to being president.
Why is it then that these Democrats can't win elections unless they do nothing but take the vote of inner city votes and also allow as many illegal aliens to vote as possible and to do everything they can to reduce voter ID laws? The only reason you would want to loosen the restrictions on who can vote, and the only reason you'd have a discussion in the first place about citizens non-voting, which is a non sequitur actually, is to make sure that you can find enough people to pass your policies, which would not normally pass under the American system if the rules were followed.
Or you care about equal justice for all and an equal voice for all in your government.
We have an equal justice for all and we have an equal voice for all. I'm a Republican in California. I could make the case that my vote for president doesn't count, but that's just not true. It does count. My vote for president counts because I vote for California's vote for the president. Now, as it turns out, I'm pretty heavily outnumbered here in California, but that's not predestination and that's nothing else. And to say that my vote doesn't count just because it means I'm going to be outvoted, doesn't mean my vote doesn't count, and it doesn't mean I'm not represented either. I get to vote for the President of the United States by the vote I cast for him, and then my state goes the way of the states, which means that since the states elect the president and not the individual people of large population centers who all want the same thing, because of those
You keep making that argument, Bill, but they're saying, at least Jamelle Bouie's point is
wrong,
that it's
Scott.
just not true that there are lots of Republicans in New York and there are lots of Democrats in Nebraska.
Fine,
officers would have to campaign across the country.
I get the argument. So he's saying that large cities can produce as many Republican winners as Democratic winners. Okay, that's a statement. That statement, as it turns out, is subject to verification. So why don't we go down the list of American cities and see which ones are run by Republicans and which ones are run by Democrats?
He did not say that they would win. He said that everybody would campaign across the country.
So what he's saying is, even though Republicans would never win because now we are no longer appealing to the country, now we're appealing to the city, because the fact of the matter is pretty simple. I know people in New Orleans and San Francisco are going to have a problem with this, but I don't care. When I say inner city, I don't mean like black inner city ghettos. I'm talking about the life inside a city, not suburbia. The inner city life of a city is pretty much the same anywhere in the country. You have the same problems everywhere in the country, and you have the same issues everywhere in the country, and you have to deal with the same things. You have to make the same promises. And the thing that the Democrats like about this is that people in cities are easy to control because you get to determine where they go and when they go there because they have to use mass transit. You own the mass transit. You get to determine what they see, what they hear, where they go, what they do. You get to determine who picks up their garbage. You get to determine who taxes them through the eyeballs. So it's not a surprise that the Democrats want to maintain this at all. But unfortunately for them, there is a strip of America between the East River, between the Hudson River and the Los Angeles River. There is, in fact, a bit of a country between those two locations. And the idea that those people, you heard him, those Rust Belt degenerates, as it basically is tone, that those people should have a vote in how the country is run when all of us smart people are in Washington and New York and Los Angeles. that just drips of condescension. This is not an appeal to democracy. It's not an appeal to the rights of the individual people, because the rights of the people in this country are very, very finely protected. And the more we mess around with those protections, the worse it gets for us. That's why the Democrats want to change this system, because this system is designed to stop tyranny. That's how the country was built. The country was built the government was built with one purpose in mind. There were many other advantages to be gained, but the United States federal government, the government of the United States, was designed specifically to distribute power as widely as possible in order to avoid the kind of dictatorial relationship that progressives absolutely desire. They have to enforce their will on other people, because if they try to convince them of their own policies, no one goes along with it. So they can call it whatever they want to. It's tyranny, it's authoritarianism, it's anti-democratic, and it's all of these things. And I suspect that Jamelle knows this, but certainly AOC doesn't know it. She's I'm sure AOC thinks that you know.
Be nice now.
I am. Well, never mind.
Ladies and gentlemen, 5 times a week, Bill Whittle Now comes to you analyzing the news of the day in the context of time-tested principles, constitutional concepts notwithstanding, depending on your interpretation. Bill Whittle is funded by the members at BillWhittle.com. That's what makes this possible. And those folks have gone to that website and clicked that Become a Member link. We'd invite you to do the same. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making it happen.